and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
Gareth had to quickly pick up his microphone at that point, but don't worry, you can't
ready.
see that, so that's okay. So there's a thing at the moment where apparently most podcasts are now becoming visual podcasts. So you have to record them. I'm guessing, Gareth, we couldn't pull that off. Not because you're not handsome enough, but because at various times we're in various places doing various things.
And maybe people want to watch me panic and grab my microphone at the last
Well,
moment.
it'd be like the Graham Norton show, only less classy, something like that. Anyway, enough of that. Welcome to this episode of Battling with Business. This is our part 2 in a series of episodes where we're trying to tackle, think about, explore, because I don't think we have the answers. I'm sure we couldn't have the answers at this point, what it means for leadership, management, culture, all the things we've talked about over our more than 150 episodes in this new world of AI. And in the last episode, if you haven't listened to it, it might be worth doing. We talked a little bit about what a reasonable guess at a future world of AI might look like, not in a tomorrow's world kind of a way. That reference probably doesn't work for people under a certain age, not in a sort of a pontificating kind of way, but just extrapolating things that seem reasonable. In that, we can absolutely see today AI helping to guide and drive decisions that humans take. Product managers, lawyers, doctors, we talked about that. But also we can see how in the future it seems very reasonable that AI could replace humans. I mean, I mentioned the word doctors. We talked about the idea of there's a point at which we could imagine, whether it happens or not, AIs replace doctors or call center operators. I think we spent 10 minutes talking about how calling the bank at the moment frustrates us eternally and we'd happily have an eye at the other end. Anyway, the point being is, this world of AI is not should it happen, it is how is it happening, and it's probably happening faster than we think.
I think you're right. Whether the Tomorrow World reference work for the audience or not, we're not exploring the trends of where is this technology going and how is it going to improve, or what we're exploring is what are the impacts of it.
We said we committed podultery, which in itself is podultery because that's a term from the podcast we're going to recommend. The rest is Politics UK. Rory Stewart has done, until now at least, a 3-part series on exactly that, looking at AI and talking about some other aspects. We very much recommend you go listen to that. It's a very, very useful context. But coming back to the point of what we were talking about was another element that we can imagine governments, businesses, and the military using AI not just to write letters, draft letters, or extract information, but to make major policy and strategy decisions. If you want to think it is plausible that at some point the next budget will be developed by an AI that will try and imagine what it will be. So some significant change in the way things will work.
I think there's an interesting point there as well. I was reflecting on this having come away from the last recording, which is we are anchored at the moment in the impact of large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, those kind of things. And that's how we're framing a lot of this discussion, and I'm sure that's how a lot of the listeners are thinking about AI. But AI is much broader than that. And I've heard several technologists talk about AI as AI is whatever the current computing challenge is. And as soon as that challenge gets solved, we stop talking about it as AI. So I referenced a couple of things in the last recording, which were satellite navigation systems. And obviously satellite navigation is a very discrete technology. But off the back of that, we now have AI recommended routes and support to travel planning. We don't talk about that as AI because that's routinely part of our lives already. We're going to see the same with autonomous vehicles. We're going to see the same with a lot of the way that technology that we currently interact with is operated, and the operating systems, which won't be talking directly to a large language model. It will be embedded in the way that systems work. In industry, for example, we've already seen a massive shift from production of products to move to subscription services. And I'm not talking about things like Netflix, because of course that's a very tangible example that we're all familiar with. I'm talking about things like heavy industry manufacturing. For the airline industry, most aircraft manufacturers don't now manufacture aircraft as a product. They manufacture flight hours as a service.
Yeah, and the most common one of that is Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce,
with
yeah.
engines. They were the first ones to say, we will sell you 900 hours of engine time.
Yeah.
So it's
Massey Ferguson, famous tractor producer, no longer produces tractors. They produce services that require heavy vehicles. So you don't buy a tractor, you buy a subscription to the ability to manage your fields. And Massey Ferguson tractors are now some of the most advanced vehicles currently in existence, and they use things like data from satellite imagery that is live updated to make sure that the thing on the back of the tractor that's doing something to the field is managed with real-time data updates. We're getting to a point now where they're starting to produce drones, so uncrewed, small uncrewed vehicles that are flying around fields and zapping individual weeds with lasers. And they're identifying those weeds using computer vision AI systems. They're doing nutrient analysis. They're doing water table analysis, and they're adding all this data together to increase the productivity of farms. I think we're going to see that across all industries and all services.
Well, you raise something which I think is a real positive, but also there's an opportunity. So the real positive is your point, which is very well taken, is our perception of what AI is probably a very narrow perception, and that there's more AI today than we can imagine. And the takeaway for me is we are already adapting to it. So I think going back to the one we can all understand is Google Maps, is that nobody worries about Google Maps. There aren't philosophical discussions about should we use Google Maps? Is Google Maps good or bad? We just use Google Maps. But there is still this, I think Google Maps, if I stretch that analogy, becomes a good one, which is there were still people driving off cliffs with Google Maps. And so you still have to be thoughtful about how you use the technology and how you say, okay, we can't be stupid and ignore it. There's one last thing as well about this world that we're moving into, and that is, this is one which, it was interesting. We had a bit of a debate about this last time, which is one of the things about AI is that the way it is designed, particularly LLMs, but generally AI, is the sense that we know what you're telling us, but we don't know why you're telling us that. Now, I think your point was that's not in itself a problem, which I agree with. I think you also, my point was, well, we don't know whether they're making mistakes or not. And your point was humans make mistakes. But I think there's something really interesting there that we can't lose, which is we do have to be very, very careful. I think we've got an example of that coming up later on that we'll talk about why that matters, that we don't know why an AI has come up with an answer. But that was more, that was our Tomorrow's World looking to the future, Rory Stewart-esque, what the world could look like. What we started in the first episode was we asked 3 questions. We attempted to explore the first one. The 3 questions were this: how can a leader lead an AI, or someone who is using AI? What does that mean for leaders and managers? And I think we spent a whole bunch of time on that. Really, there was a couple of things I took away from that there will be lots of people who are replaced in terms of their job. I think that's inevitable. But the bit that I sort of missed was I mentally got this assumption that the managers would be safe, and that the managers was, as it were, swap out human beings that worked for them with AIs that work for them. And I think your point was, no, the managers will be replaced as well. So there's a lot there.
Well, I don't think it's as definitive as that, but I think my point was, markets work off efficiency and what works best. So if a human machine team is better than just a human, then we will see the adoption of those machines to support the human. If a machine on its own is better than a human machine team, then we will see the machine replace that human in that job. Um, if a human is better than a human machine team or a machine, then the human will keep their job. And the example we talked about was a sort of fictitious example of where the AI is better at making the decision, in which case, why would you pay a human?
I think that's right. And I think then that what there's all sorts of things from there, which is what does that mean for people, for in inverted commas, the remaining people, because I think that changes their workload and how they work. But then the more specific to AI about management and leadership was this idea, are future managers going to be managers or even leaders, or do they simply become, and this is the language I used last time, the legally responsible interface between the AI and the organization?
Yeah.
A different way of saying it is, if you boil this down, and this is taking it to extreme, is the new role of the manager ultimately be the person who says no to the computer? That's interesting. We also explored a little bit about what does responsibility look like if an AI makes a decision that has a significant detrimental impact on another person or another organization? Who is responsible for that? Is the AI responsible for that? That doesn't seem right. Is the manager or the leader responsible for that? So lots of interesting questions. Anyway, that was the first question. If you're interested in that, please do go back to the first episode and we talk about it in more detail. And I should say, again, this is more because I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what the impact is. And I think if you'd have said to people just before the Industrial Revolution, what will the impact be on leaders and managers or the equivalent terms, I think they would have done a very poor job of not being able to understand what that would look like.
Yeah.
I think we're almost certainly in the same place. But I am absolutely crystal clear that this is an important and interesting question because we want to maximize the opportunities. So here's the next two questions that we talked about. And these are the ones that we'll try and cover today. The next question is, how do you create experience and knowledge in your organization when it would seem, at the moment at least, that the first roles to go are the more junior ones? In other words, well, my interns cost me X amount a year and the AI are at least as good as interns, I'll get rid of them. Well, but the interns become the entry-level people. The entry-level people become the mid-management. The mid-management become the... If you're chopping that up, what does that mean? That's the first question. And then the last question that we'll try and capture today is, and this maybe is a really, really difficult one. And Gareth, just before we came on, was talking about a really interesting example that gets to the heart of this. As AI becomes more predominant in an organization, if your organization cares about values, culture, and trust, and previously humans have, as it were, owned those values, the culture and trust, and more importantly, been the ones that live those and guard them or protect them, as it were, in a world where there is 50% AI or more, how do you manage that? How do you maintain empathy with humans that you're engaging with? So those are the three questions, and we'll cover those two hopefully in this episode.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things to explore. One of the things that strikes me is when we're talking about these things, we are again anchored in our experience of talking about machines. And historically, of course, machines have been either mechanical systems that are very predictable because they are built to do a repetitive task or to work in a certain way, or digital systems that again are quite predictable because they are built around Boolean logic. This idea of if then, if that,
But you
then
maintain
this.
your predictability. You can build the rules in and you know they'll be followed.
Yes, and it's binary. It's binary logic. So at its simplest, a switch is either off or on. You can turn the machine on. You can turn it off. But when you start building digital logic systems, those results, they might be happening at speeds that are well beyond our ability to comprehend because they're effectively happening at machine speeds, at the speed of light. But when you break down how and why the system does what it does, these are really, really, it's basically maths. Yeah, it is calculatable. The difference now is that we're talking about algorithms, and algorithms are set rules for how things do computations, but they have feedback mechanisms, which means you are introducing new information that changes the output result. So you can't predict with a degree of certainty what the output is going to be. There is uncertainty brought into the system through new data.
Well, let me give you it's a feedback loop. And so if ever you've had a microphone and you've walked too close to the speaker,
Yeah.
there's a point at which the feedback makes the speaker go bonkers.
Yes,
There's
exactly that.
that's a poor analogy, but
No,
it gives you
I think it works really well. I think it's a good understanding of how an electromechanical system, when you introduce new information, very, very quickly becomes complex and unpredictable. And a feedback loop, whilst we know what is going to happen if you put a microphone close to a speaker, you'll get this really loud noise, you get lots of hissing, and it gets higher and higher pitch. What you can't do is predict the exact frequencies because the environment is adding a level of unpredictability and chaos to that system. And that's exactly how the algorithms in AI work. So you can very, very quickly understand what the algorithm is and how it's weighted, i.e. how it uses the input data. What you can't do is predict what that input data is going to be.
Well, let's go back to, isn't it? Sorry, just before we do this, the thing that makes me uncomfortable as we talk about this is this lack of predictability.
Yeah.
I think that's at the heart of AI is what makes so much of this so both difficult and provides discomfort. I can make a machine where if I press the button, the light comes on, and if I don't press the button, the light won't come on. And now I can predict it. I know what's going to happen. If it goes wrong, I know how to fix it.
Yeah.
We love that predictability, and it allows us to apply rules around it. It applies to think about how we're going to apply those rules, the doctrine, what we want to achieve. The moment you say, I've built a really important system where I press the button and the light might or might not come on, now you've got a real challenge. So
yeah, and of course, as humans, we're used to dealing with unpredictability. So leading teams of other humans, people are.
But we don't like it though. We're used to it. But if you said, what if I could, it's going to sound terrible, what if I could have a band of robots working for you where you don't have to worry about one morning one of the robots comes in saying something terrible has happened at home.
Yeah.
And I think we really like and hold on to predictability.
And in a pre-digital, pre-electronic systems era, we've talked on the podcast before, Frederick Winslow Taylor talks about trying to make people on production lines as uniform as possible, to the point where he was measuring the distance that they should stand and painting lines on the floor so that their movements are as efficient as possible. Now, of course, in the world of mechanics, you can replace those production line people with robots and get that level of precision. And that's great in complicated systems where you want predictable inputs, predictable outputs. Where you want creativity, you want a level of unpredictability. I think we're used to it with managing people, and perhaps we need to think about how AI is going to be similar as a challenge. The difference, of course, is these systems are doing computations at unfathomable speeds, and so the outputs are far quicker than we can manage to keep up with. But we also deal with uncertainty when we go out into the world, into the environment that we live in. So the weather is unpredictable. And we have coping mechanisms and strategies for dealing with unpredictable weather. Farmers are constantly having to deal with the challenge of unpredictability of the system that they operate in and yet we have got really, really quite capable farming processes that we've developed over thousands of years. So I think perhaps part of this is reframing our approach to what these systems are, to how we tackle the challenge. But secondly, we also have to recognise that there's a fundamental difference in that these aren't individual AI robots. So we can't
Yeah.
replace a person with an AI. It is a nexus, it is a system. Even on an intranet that isn't connected to the wider Internet of Things, you still have this connectivity so that an input into one part of the system updates the information across the system. And so at machine speeds, you get changes across the system. That is really, really interesting, challenging. It's an opportunity. It's also a threat.
You've mentioned something as well, which I'm guilty of, which is anthropomorphizing AI. I've done this multiple times, and I'm sure I'll continue to do it, which is equating an AI to a human being. And what I'm not trying to say is that they are equivalent to a human being, but I'm just sort of saying
But I think we're trying to find that equivalence, aren't we? We're trying to work out who will get their jobs replaced by the AI.
Well, but the point I'm making here is we like to think of the AI as, you only have to put googly eyes on a box and that will make us feel much more comfortable.
Yes.
Oh, he's less threatening. He's got googly eyes. Anyway, let's get back to that first question. The first question was, how do you create experience and knowledge when the first roles to go are the junior ones? And I want to talk about this because the logical answer is if you have 5 stations or 5 stages of experience, and all of a sudden you now have 4 stages of experience, you just compress the stage of experience. So Chris, this is a pointless conversation. You just have to sort of adjust that you've got a shorter amount of time to build this. The reason why I wanted to raise this as a question, and it touched on something we talked about, I think a couple of episodes ago when we talked about the value of people dropping out of university and how we've seen lots of our influencers drop out of university, and then some of them perhaps, and I'm not suggesting there's necessarily a connection, demonstrate that they aren't fully rounded human beings. They haven't learned all the things. The point I'm making here is, in a sense, it's not that there are 5 steps to build experience. It is the duration of time that those steps take.
Yeah.
Create an experience that leads to experience. I use the wrong words there, but the point I'm making is if you learn something in an hour, saying I'm going to learn the same thing in 50 minutes is very difficult.
Yes.
Part of the time is participating. So you said this very well in the last episode. The interns who do the photocopying and make the coffee, it would be easy to say, well, all they're doing is making coffee and photocopying. That has no value, and so we can replace them. But you made the very good point. I think this is very important, which is, number one, it grounds people. You should understand what has to happen for the world to continue. You need to remember why thanking the cleaner so that your office doesn't. That's number one. But the second thing was, as you pointed out, is they're experiencing things in a safe way.
Yep.
They are hearing people with experience. They are participating in a very basic way. And so going back to the fundamental question, what do you do if you start to chop away at some or a lot of that experience? It's not just a simple case of, well, can we teach them in 4 steps?
Yeah.
It's a case of the value was the process and the time it took to learn, rather than because we can just teach them some more efficient steps.
I think if you assume that experience journey, 20 years in the legal profession, or pick any sort of any job, if you assume that still remains as a requirement, the challenge becomes, how do you convince organisations now not to take the short-term positive of we can save money by cutting away the boring, dull, low-paid jobs at the bottom and replacing those with AI, and then in 5, 10, 15 years recognising that, we don't have a talent pool to pull people from. I suppose what you could argue, though, is how important is that experience in 15 years based on the rate of change? So in the military, it's quite an unusual system, I suppose, in that you can't apply for a job based on how much you back yourself and you say, "Do you know what, I've got a good CV, I went to a good school, I think I'm really good at what I do, so there's a job opening coming up, I'm going to apply for it." It doesn't work like that. You promote through a very rigid rank structure. So if you're a non-commissioned officer, you join as a soldier, sailor, aircrew, and you make your way up. And the highest rank you can get to as a non-commissioned officer is a warrant officer. What you can't do is join and then 2 years in go, "Do you know what, I think I'm better than everybody else. I'm ahead of my peer group. I'm going to apply to be the regimental sergeant major." You have to go through that career progression. Same for officers. You can't, as a junior lieutenant, go, "I'm brighter than my peer group.
I'm going to run a regiment.
I'm going to apply to be the brigadier or, the general." And there's very good reasons for that. But what's interesting is as the pace of change speeds up, and I'm making the assumption it does rather than we just perceive it as doing, it becomes less and less relevant to have that 20 years of experience because your experience is grounded in a world that is completely different. So you could argue that actually it doesn't matter that we're getting rid of the interns, as long as in 15 or 20 years' time, you have a talent pool that matches the requirements for the time.
I think that is very, very well said.
But we do need to think about that now, because we need to start to think about what skills are required, what experiences are required.
Well, let's come back to that, because I think there's a whole thing about training, and I wonder, you've heard me rant on multiple episodes about how poorly we do training in organizations. I wonder whether this is the rebirth of people saying, okay, I'm going to take this, for want of a better word, unconventional path to move people to experience. And the way for me to do that is to create some very specific training. By the way, they have this in the police today, I believe, where you can fast track in the police force.
Yeah.
Where historically it would have been, well, for you to be a detective inspector, you would have to do 20 years on the beat or going through it. And now we're going to fast track people, the management consultants. But for that to be true, there must be training. I want to go back to tell a story about experience, because I think we have to be very careful not to mix too quickly skills and experience, because they are not the same thing. I had someone who worked for me once, very, very talented person. They have gone far and they will go even further. And they came to me and said, "I want to become a successful product manager." And so we talked about what that would mean. And we identified a number of skills and areas where they would need to build experience in order to then be able to lead people and say, "I understand how these things work." And so, for want of a better word, there were sort of 10 tick boxes for this person to meet. And I remember bringing him on, and my job was to give him the opportunity to understand what those sort of areas of skills might be and to put in a position to do them. And I almost remember he came to me at the end of the first year going like, "Done. I've ticked all the boxes." And I said, No, you don't understand. What I'm not looking for is that you've done this thing once.
As quickly as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What I'm looking for is you've done this thing 5 times, 10 times.
You've
because it's only when you've done it
Yeah.
exactly, mastery. And it was really interesting. A year later, we had another conversation. He went, "Oh, I understand what you mean now, because I did it once." And I went, "Well, I now know everything about it. And the next 2 times it happened to me, it turns out
It was different.
It was different."
Yeah.
And so this idea of how do you compress the experience, the right experience, and how do you tailor the training to it? And that leads to...
But that is all premised on the assumption that the job of product manager
is X.
It will still exist.
I do agree with you. I'll give you another example, which was when I was learning to fly in the Navy.
Were you in the Navy?
All right. For the man who's got more dits than me, easy, Tiger. When we would get on an aeroplane and we would go do navigation exercises, and we would use something called a whiz wheel, which was a Dalton flight computer. It is a long piece of card with numbers on it and a wheel that moves around, and you could calculate speed, wind drift, various exciting things. And at that time, GPS was just becoming a thing. And so what would happen is we would manually navigate the aircraft using these techniques that frankly hadn't changed since the First World War, or particularly the Second World War. And we would say, why can't we just use the GPS? And our instructors would time and time again say, we're teaching you these basic skills, knowing you'll use GPS at some point, but when the GPS stops working, you need to understand the background.
Yeah.
The reality is today, I would be staggered if those students are still taught those skills, because the GPS, the computers are so reliable.
Yes,
if they stop working, everything has stopped working. So this is your point about we, as humans, we are very poor at understanding what skills we need for the future. We're good at knowing what skills we need in the past, what skills we need now. We're very reluctant to change those skills.
And there's a balance there, of course. And the military is a very easy example to talk about, because you are operating in a contested environment where people will actively try and disrupt your technological advances or advantages. So GPS, for example, will deliberately be denied or jammed in a warfighting context. So it's very easy to say, well, imagine if the GPS isn't working because it's been jammed, how are you going to do this job? So we talk about reversionary modes and resilience. So I think that's something we need to consider, is how much do you need to understand the underlying principles? How much do you need to practice it for when the system breaks, when things don't work? But also, there's a point at which where you say, this is just not a relevant job anymore. So there are far fewer Thatchers and Coopers in the world now, certainly in the UK, than there were 100 years ago, because there are far fewer thatched roofed houses and far less need to have wooden barrels. There isn't necessarily a need for a reversionary mode, because there isn't going to be a situation where suddenly we have to retrograde back to
you say
traditional
that
building
if AI
styles.
goes all wrong. But no, you're right. You're absolutely
We've learned better ways of doing things. The introduction of electrification means that a lot of mechanical factory jobs don't exist anymore. So the balance here is about understanding what skills and experience are still going to be relevant, and then working out methods of efficiently getting people to gain experience doing that, whilst also understanding how the world of work, the world of employment, the world of organisations is going to change. So if we're saying we're currently developing product managers, so we've got junior people coming in, they're learning some management skills, they're learning the project management skills, the product development skills. We have to question, is that going to be a role? And if it is a role in 10, 15 years' time, are those skills still going to be relevant, or are there new skills? Is a student who is using AI to do their homework cheating and not learning the skills?
Or adapting to a new tool set that will be the one that will be used.
Or are they now using new tools and developing new skills and experience that might be more relevant? So, I mean, I have this battle as a parent. I'm trying to work out how to protect my children from social media. I want them to go and get fresh air. I want them to run around outside. I want them to get, dirty in the garden and build dens and do all the things that I did. But I also want them to grow up to be digitally native. So I want them to understand how to use a tablet, use a phone. And I'm trying to find that balance, and it's really difficult.
Well, it's this classic thing of going back to the analogy I gave earlier about the Industrial Revolution. We're trying to figure it out. Just to come back to this question of training, and we'll stop for a break in a second. Maybe this is more of a philosophical question. Let's sort of go back to the people I am removing from role X are the 20 to 25-year-olds, because they offer no real value to me and an AI can do it better. What do we want to do with those 25-year-olds or 20-year-olds on the assumption we still want them in our industry later on?
Yeah.
Do we send them away for 5 years and say, just come back in 5 years and then you start your journey with us? Do we say, you know how you would have done the work for the next 5 years or 2 years, you're going to do the training for the work. That's what would you do with those people? Because it's not just a case of, I don't need you.
Yeah.
It is the case of, well, but you're going to need someone. Even though you're sort of cutting off the earlier start, you still need people coming later. So that's going to be fascinating as well.
Yeah, and I think it's probably not as black and white as we don't need them for the first 5 years, so we'll wait until they're 5 years older. You would just accelerate their journey because of course AI gives you the ability to grow. So you still need people, you still want to use them, but you're going to use them in a different way. But I think there's a really interesting analogy with the military.
Just before you get there, does that start to undermine one of the values of AI, which is I want to use AI because I don't want to pay the intern. The reason I'm using the AI is because it is cheaper.
Yes. But what are you going to do with the money you're saving?
Well,
are you going to grow the business?
But this is the point. But before we get to that, but if the point is I have to accelerate the training of the other people, I'm not getting rid of people. I'm just doing different things.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? There's a weird thing here, which I don't think it's a simple, I'm using AI so I can get rid of people. The way we've just described it could just as well be I'm using AI while I'm still paying those people, but teaching them different things.
Yeah, but from a business perspective, you're only ever going to do things for one of two reasons. One, it's a cost saving.
Yep.
Or two, it's going to increase profit. You're going to make more money. I'm being slightly redundant.
But I think I agree with you. But if the second one is related to the first one, I think.
Yeah.
I would say the first one is cost saving. The second one is a better outcome for your customers.
So if you are creating an efficiency saving by using AI instead of interns, rather than saying, well, we'll just recruit people who are 5 years older, you're going to use those graduates in a different way, because why would you send them away for 5 years? You would just you would perhaps accelerate their career journey compared to how traditionally you would have used them, or you will use them in a different way. You might have less employees overall, though.
I think that's the trick. But the point I'm making is
But I don't think you're going to send people away.
That's the point. I think a lot of people think, well, this is great. I don't have to pay for all those interns. That's 10% of my budget I can cross out, and that increases my profits. As we've just said, well, that might not be the case, because the 10% you thought you would stop paying in salaries, you still have to pay.
Yes.
Maybe you have to pay less, you pay fewer, but you still have to do it. The takeaway for me, as before we finish on the break, though, is this idea of how do you develop the skills and experience is something which we already are pretty bad at doing today in general terms as a society. I think there is an opportunity to say, if I'm going to bring AI, I'm going to have a manager who potentially doesn't have 20 years of management experience. I'm going to have a manager who has maybe 10 years of experience. Well,
and you're working on the assumption that a human machine team has a similar, the same, or better outcome with a manager of 10 years experience and a machine versus a manager with 20 years experience. So there's an analogy here to the military, which is, in the military, we don't know what the next war is going to be. We don't know who it's going to be against. We don't know what technologies are going to be involved. We don't know how societies will have moved on. But we can make some sensible decisions about trends. We can understand technologies. We can understand social change. We can look at threats in the world. And that's what national security strategies and defense strategies are all about. A very famous military historian called Michael Howard once said something very, very relevant, which he said the art of developing military capability is not about being right about the prediction of the future war. It's about being not so far wrong that you can't adapt when it happens. And I think we're in the same space here. We can't foresee and predict how AI is going to change the world of work, but we can, with a certain amount of sensible trend analysis, a certain amount of pragmatic assessment of how things are developing, make some assumptions and make sure that we're not so far wrong that in 10 years' time we don't have the talent for our businesses to work. And if we are wrong and our businesses don't work, then that's how markets work. The businesses that were closer to being right will be more efficient, will be better, and they will fill that gap. So I think the job now is to recognise that we're not trying to predict the future and get it bang on. We're trying to build resilience for the change that is coming.
I think that's beautifully said. And what I'm proud of us is that we haven't once said this so far, AI is good or bad. We just said, how do you think about it? How do you deal with it? Let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll talk about some of our favourite topics: values, culture, and trust.
Wonderful.
When you've got a box with googly eyes that is called Billy AI. See, I've even named him now. He's now called Billy.
I trust him more now.
Exactly. See, there you go. And how could Billy with googly eyes do anything terrible? He would never do anything terrible. See you after the break.
All right. Look forward to it.
Welcome back. It's just complicated stuff, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, well, we'll see.
Well,
someone will listen to this in 30 years' time, probably our kids, because no one else will care, and then laugh at us for being so wrong.
Is it complicated or is it complex?
Oh, stop it. That's too much. That's too much. Well, look, so let's get back to the next question. With fewer or no people involved, what does AI mean for organizations that care about values, culture, and trust? And it's probably worth us sort of starting to talk about these concepts in machine terms. You can teach an AI cultures and value.
You can teach it to. So I.
Well, no, actually, that's probably that's interesting because it's probably the wrong phrase. You can provide information to an AI that represents certain values and culture. So, for example, this is was it the Microsoft Nazi chatbot?
Grok, wasn't it?
Well, but no, I think Microsoft had a racist chatbot.
Yeah. And
Grok. Anyway, the point being here is
the Mecha Hitler was definitely a Grok thing.
The Mecha Hitler was a Grok, but AI is merely is probably a poor word, is merely a representation of the data that it has been provided.
Yes.
So if you provide it with racist data, don't worry, we're not going to claim AI a racist, but I'm trying to make this point. Never mind racist. If you provide it with data that only represents pacifist viewpoints, when you ask it questions, it will repeat back pacifist viewpoints. In other words, it is a representation of the data that it has been supplied.
Yeah.
And so when I said you can train an AI to have a certain culture, the point there is if you provide it with a very specific selected cultural set of training materials, then you potentially have some sense of its culture. And if not, you get racist chatbots and Grok Hitler who says, kill them all. We've never liked them anyway.
I had a rather facile and sort of infantile sort of debate with ChatGPT the other day about whether cereal can be defined as soup. It's classic kind of late night drunken
You really need
debate.
to get out more, Gareth.
And I was demonstrating to somebody what AI can do and how it can work, and so I thought that would be an interesting sort of debate to get into, or conversation with an AI. And what was really interesting was it was coming up with both logical arguments for and against, but then it was also inferencing that this wasn't a very serious discussion. And it was sort of talking about how, from a food science point of view, cereal is not classed as soup, but culturally, late night when people are drunk on the internet, this becomes a debate, and there are lots of and it was inferencing the culture around that conversation without me saying this isn't a serious conversation. What was also quite interesting was there was a point where I said, well, what do you know about whether it's soup or not? You don't eat. And it very quickly came back and said, "You're entirely right. My whole understanding of whether cereal is soup is based on analysing large volumes of data from actual people who've had these conversations. So whilst your understanding of it is emotional, is real, you've actually eaten soup," and then it made a joke about the fact that I'd probably reheated it because it assumes I'm a student, I assume, I don't know. And then it said, "I don't have that. I've never eaten soup. I'm just studying the data." And so I think the point here is the AI doesn't imbibe your culture. It's not, it doesn't have values in the way that we currently talk about human values, but it does weight information based on an inference of people's values. And I suppose there's a semantic point where you go, well, isn't that just a value? If it's weighting something on on its importance, on its prioritization, well, that's just, it has values. They just probably aren't attached to sentient emotion.
We're back to this real problem again, which is about predictability.
Mm.
So how do I predict whether the AI model that we are using to make decisions or even communicate with customers actually has the values that we would wish it to have? And given the point we made at the very beginning, which is we understand what the AI tells us, but we don't understand how it's got there, that can be really, really difficult.
Yeah.
I want you to repeat a conversation we had before we started recording, because again, like the feedback analogy we used in the first half, I think it's really important, which is this idea that we find it difficult to understand how an AI does things and thinks and operates, can lead to some very unexpected outcomes. This is very bad. Could you talk about a visual experiment that was done? Can you do that on a podcast that isn't visual?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's simple enough that it's quite easy to explain. The first thing I will say is I was sent this and I haven't actually fact-checked it. So it could be that I'm being, strung along and this is actually a manipulated thing. But it was a very famous meme or a picture that is used a lot in memes that's quite famous of a
couple,
a man, with his presumably partner, and he's looking back over his shoulder at another woman, and then people put their own text underneath it. It's a meme. ChatGPT was asked to replicate that image 200 times exactly the same. So each time it is going to replicate the same image, but it's going to use the last produced image to replicate it again. And the experiment was to see how close to the original image it can keep and where the distortions are. What was interesting, and again, I don't know if this was actually done under experimental conditions, but when you play the video, it flicks through these 200 images. The people very, very quickly morph into different people. And then they continue to morph into other people, and their positions change, the environment changes,
their expressions are accentuated,
expressions change, their ethnicity changes, and very quickly you end up with images that are very representative of actual people. And some of the people that come through very, very clearly are Kim Jong-un.
Weird.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
I think I saw Jeff Bezos briefly in there. Mr. T from the A-Team.
I missed him. I should go back and watch.
Yeah.
Pity the fool.
But basically, the way it was sort of described to me is what is happening is as the feedback of the last image goes back into the system, those environmental noise changes. So it isn't, remember, this isn't Boolean algebra. So it's not saying this pixel here has this color and therefore we must put that pixel with that color. Otherwise it would always be the same. What it's doing is inferring the image and then trying to recreate it. So those slight deviations, those slight changes over time get really, really exacerbated. And that's where this inference model deviates from the norm. And what it does is it uses its data set to weight things. And the data set it has is looking at images of people from the wider internet. And the vast majority of images of people on the internet that are not restricted under copyright are of famous people. That is not that confusing. So there are more pictures of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un on the internet than there are pictures of you or me. That's not surprising. And so what it is considering as the norm, the average, is actually very specifically the norm in a particular data set. And so it's not surprising when you think about it like that, that this image very quickly morphs into these famous people. I think that's a really good way of very simply understanding that these are not fixed systems, they are feedback loops. And as a result, there is a combination of error that creeps in and deviation from the original starting point, and there is a convergence on the norm.
Well, in simple terms, if you start with a set of values of culture and you say to the AI, this is what we represent, given this sort of feedback loop, you could not predict what that might end up looking like.
No.
Based on
Yeah.
the opacity of the model, the learning material, etc. Now, I think this is where I get on the edge of, I don't know how well you can train and control and constrain. Again, you could probably put rules in, but fundamentally,
but once you're doing that, those rules are put in by a systems engineer who is subjectively deciding. So if you're trying to balance your algorithm based on the fact that, I don't know, perhaps a minority of viewpoints within a certain culture are louder than the others. So perhaps, I don't know, the demographic of 18 to 30-year-olds are far more active on the internet than 30 to 50-year-olds. I don't know. I'm making this up.
No, but your point
plausible.
is then that all of a sudden
So
the 18 to 30-year-old
they're going to be louder.
viewpoints are louder and more represented in the AI results.
So as a systems engineer, you might weight it so that 30 to 50-year-olds have their views, their data is worth more to try and balance that out. The amount you weight it is subjective. Now, normally, systems engineers doing this, what they will tend to do is run a beta test, and then there will be another algorithm, another AI system that is monitoring the effect of weighting, and it will try and balance the weighting. But ultimately, it's still that subjective start point of that engineer.
I know the answer to this, by the way. You put posters up in the office for the AI to look at, because that's how we get people to adopt values today.
Well,
but that leads,
really interesting
that
point.
leads us to the really, I think, the leadership and the management point of this, which is, if you are a CEO of an organization and a significant proportion of your organization that is making decisions or making suggestions or even communicating directly with your customers, how do you manage and control that culture? And I made a flippant comment about we put posters up on the wall, and there's probably a systems equivalent of putting posters on the wall. But we've said on a number of occasions, this idea of the culture of an organization is lived and is really difficult. In fact, I think we typically say anyone who thinks just putting posters up on the wall is missing the point. That's not how you're going to generate this culture. That has got to be really, really difficult. How are you going to do this? And it almost links back to some of the earlier questions we have, which is a customer complains and says, your chatbot said something incredibly racist to me, or your chatbot denied me a loan because we don't give loans to your type of people. That How do you manage that? How do you manage the AI? How do you manage the customers? And then going all the way to the top of a CEO, how do you ensure that the cultures you represent are represented all the way through your organization?
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? So when we talk about culture and organizations, and typically we're talking about leading people, we quite often talk about the fact that it's about setting the right tone. It's about focusing on the things that you care about and the values, about understanding the things that your employees care about and value. So it's not as simple as we're going to put
I
some values on
declare
a
they're
poster
X. Yeah, yeah.
and then suddenly that is
Yeah.
your culture. It's about you literally cultivate your culture like growing a garden. So you prune out the weeds that you don't like. You water and feed and nourish the plants that you do like, and you hope that they grow and flourish in the environment. So the gardening analogy I quite like. As a leader, you are setting an example, but you are also able to do things like training and focusing capability, using time and resources to develop and encourage certain types of behaviours. So you reward good behaviours, you punish bad behaviours, you might have red lines. You know, these behaviours are not tolerated in this organisation, and when they come to light, we will have an investigation and we will probably sack you. There might be things that are not quite red lines, but when we see them, there will be administrative action, there might be some retraining. You know, so you can do these things. You ultimately are also beholden on the wider organisational culture of the societies that you are recruiting from. And that's why so much effort is put into making sure that recruitment processes are fair. And that's not creating equity. It's about making sure people are recruiting based on the things that are valuable to that company without being unfair. And there are
everyone has an equal opportunity to demonstrate they're the right person.
That they're the right person. Exactly that. And sometimes this needs intervention from a third party. So you might have government policy or legislation to enact and enable that. So in the UK, for example, there are, I think, 9 protected characteristics, and those are race, gender,
age,
sex, disability, age, religion,
and the other ones.
You get the kind of general sense of what they are. And there are exceptions. So if you are recruiting underwear models, for example, you are allowed to discriminate against
fat blokes like me,
against biological sex, because you don't want women modelling male underwear or vice versa. The military is allowed to discriminate against disability.
Yeah.
As are many roles, actually. If there's a physical reason why a disability won't enable you to do the job. So there's all these mechanisms and there's all these systems, but ultimately it's about leadership. It's about setting the tone and it's about tweaking and cultivating the system. What's different with AI, as we talked about, is you're not tweaking the system. You're setting the weighting of the parameters so that those feedback loops are working or not working. So suddenly you're not leading by example.
You're leading by algorithm.
You're
weighting.
You're weighting, and this is statistics. This is data science, not leadership, experience, and empathy. So there's a whole different skill set.
I was about to say, I think that's well said. It's a different skill set. It's neither good nor bad. In fact, if it works, fantastic, but it's a very different skill set.
And I would imagine you need both. I'm trying to think of an example where you wouldn't need both, because you need the leader to still be empathetic, to still have clear and strong ideals and values that they want to cultivate in that organisation. And they've got to then be able to communicate that to a data science community who can then
a very different set of skills.
Technically try to tweak and implement that in the algorithm.
Let's flip this on the head as well, because this is about leadership and management. I'm in an organization now where I'm going to anthropomorphize again. 50% of my colleagues are now been replaced by an AI system. how do we think about the humans that are left there? Because I wonder whether there's a different way of looking at it. So I'm a human, and everywhere around me, I've got AI that are faster, better, cheaper than me. That, as a human being, potentially has an impact on me. Do
Yeah.
I need to? I mean, the challenge is leadership existing to maximize short-term output, or is it about long-term organizational resilience? And a different way of saying that is, will I sometimes need to optimize not for the most efficient outcomes, but for resilience and keeping the people, the humans on my team? And that's a different skill as well, which is, it almost flips it to say we want the most efficient human beings. Now we might be saying, actually, to keep these human beings and the unique skills they bring. And we should talk about unique skills, because we haven't mentioned that yet. We've kind of made the assumption that AI equals human, but to keep those unique human skills and the humans, we may need to optimize for different things.
Yes.
The AI is all
Yeah.
about faster, quicker, cheaper. The human being might be about happier. It might be you only have to work 4 days a week because I want you to be really happy and I want you to stay.
So I think there's an added complexity in that the human machine team might be happier. It might create more happiness. It might create more happiness in your customers. It might create more happiness in your employees. It might create more happiness in your suppliers. I don't know. Happiness is a human emotion. I don't care about the happiness of my algorithm. But if having a human machine team creates a better, happier workforce overall, then that's something to consider. I think what's really interesting is you're talking about that choice of optimized efficiency in the short term versus longer term resilience and adaptability. Well, that's not a new subject for this podcast. We talk about that a lot, and not in the context of AI, but just generally in the context of complex problems. So it will come as no surprise to you that I fundamentally believe that we shouldn't constantly be driving for efficiency, because you can be efficiently wrong. And as systems change and adapt and develop, we need to adapt and develop with them. And I think AI just reinforces that. So in the military, there is a really interesting thing that is currently happening. And we're looking at the war in Ukraine at the moment as perhaps the clearest example of this, which is more and more uncrewed systems, both uncrewed ground vehicles, uncrewed air systems, and algorithmic decision-making systems are being employed. And that's creating changes to what we call the character of conflict. So there's this idea within Western military doctrine, certainly, that the nature of conflict is largely unchanging. The nature of conflict is human competition, use of violent force to impose will. The character of conflict is the technologies, the tactics, the behaviors that are employed to do that. So until we get to a point where AI has got completely out of control and we are fighting the robot overlords, that's a different nature of conflict. I don't think we're there, and I don't think we're going to get there, or I certainly hope not. But whilst we're fighting human conflict, but we're fighting it with robots, we're fighting it with uncrewed systems, there's this really interesting thing that's happening. And I think it was the CEO, but it was somebody very senior in a company called Helsing that make uncrewed systems, talked the other day about their vision of the future of war will be robots fighting robots. And that struck me as incredibly naive. And I know why they said it. It's because they sell autonomous and robotic
Robots.
systems. So they're trying to increase the value of their company and very deliberately taking a particular position. The reality is, though, if robots are fighting robots, then to gain advantage, you're going to target the people that build the robots, or you're going to target the people that tweak the algorithms.
Well, but
Yeah.
even
all you
even
do
more
is,
than that, there has to be boots on the ground, because
Well-
we've won. Well, what are we going to do now? Are we going to?
this idea of, well, we don't need boots on the ground because we'll send the robots to the war. All that does is it means that the adversary is then going to target you, who hasn't gone to the battleground in your home country. or, in a different, and it moves the battleground. So we in the West have been flying remotely piloted air systems. So they're not uncrewed remote control vehicles. They are remote control, but they are piloted, but they're piloted from the other side of the world. So things like the Predator or the Reaper that you may have heard of, the MQ-1 or the MQ-9, these are basically aircraft in the same way that piloted aircraft are. It's just the pilot sits in a virtual cockpit
In a
3,000 miles
container
away, in a
3,000 miles away. Yeah.
container 3,000 miles away. Well, where's the target? Is the target the aircraft, or is the target that container? And all you've done is you've made it harder for the adversary to target the pilot. But that adversary will still now aim to do that, so they will create weapon systems that have longer ranges. So you are shifting where the battle is, rather than removing the human from the battle. And I think that's a good analogy for the world of trust and empathy and leadership in commercial organizations, is that as we remove people from particular jobs and replace them with machines that can do those roles and jobs, you are shifting the focus from where the leadership, the human leadership, the empathy, the leading by example, the understanding of values, the cultivation of the culture has to take place.
We're coming to the end today, and I'm going to ask a question which has the risk of extending this by another 3 hours. So I'm going to constrain it and say, let's just do this for a couple of minutes. We've worked on a pseudo premise that AI is as good as humans, or could easily be as good as humans in many of these tasks.
Yeah.
Maybe not all, but many of these tasks. I've always found the interesting thing that the right businesses ask is, what are we really good at? Not what are we doing today, but what are we really good at? And you find lots of organizations that have lost their way because they've sort of drifted off to do all sorts of interesting things, but it's not what they're really good at. It's not what their real raison d'etre is.
Yeah.
If we think about those humans, do you think we today we are unique at certain things that offer that value? I mean, and I'll kick us off. Empathy is one of those things, which I think is incredibly important in terms of business and just simply making the world work. Empathy is critically important as managers and leaders. Empathy gets you a long way. You can argue, though, that you can watch 35,000 people being empathetic and you can teach an AI how to be empathetic. It isn't empathy, but it feels like empathy. It's close enough, and it might even be more empathetic than the average human being. So given that kind of idea, do you think there are either things that are unique about humans, or you think, for the moment at least, are important and give us the edge in a way that allows us to say, how can we in organizations and businesses focus on the things we as humans are either still or always be better at, or certainly as good at?
Yeah. I don't think I'm bold enough to say will always be in anything that humans currently can do. A few years ago, we were all talking about creativity. Artistic creativity is where humans, have the edge. Machines are brilliant at learning, they're brilliant at solving problems, but you know what? They're never going to be creative enough to replace art, poetry, philosophy. And the reality is, very, very quickly, we are now at a stage where people are downloading, either knowingly or unknowingly, songs on Spotify that have been created by AI, and enjoying them and having the same emotional connections to them as they do other songs. People are buying pieces of artwork that are created by AI, either knowingly or unknowingly. People are reading novels, reading poetry that has been created by AI. So I don't think there are, I would say a machine can't replicate creativity in a way that a human can. I think they already are doing that. We've got systems now that absolutely smash the Turing test out the ballpark. People believe the thing that they're communicating with at the other end of the system is a human, or they're not sure all the time.
This is not going well for humans, by the way.
So is it empathy? Well, you've just said, you can teach a system to replicate the responses of an empathetic human to the point now where actually large amounts of younger people, tends to be younger people, are now having emotional relationships with fictitious characters created in LLMs. Again, either knowingly, most commonly knowingly, but sometimes unknowingly. They are building virtual boyfriends, virtual girlfriends, virtual friends. I am currently training for another marathon, and I am routinely engaging with an LLM effectively as a coach. I'm providing it with my training data. It's providing me with feedback, and then I'm asking it questions the same way I would talk to a physical trainer, a personal
Are
trainer.
you veering towards there is nothing unique about humans?
I think I can't think of a single characteristic that a machine couldn't replicate. I think what's different, perhaps, I caveat my words, is the relationships between people, the organizational, societal cultures. And the reason I say that is I think it's not unlikely that we would have machines as part of those cultures, as part of those societies. But ultimately, at the point where we are replaced completely, well, a bit like fighting wars, whilst the robots are over there fighting themselves, the humans will need to fight each other. So we will build other robots to fight the humans. And so all you do is extend the ranges of the weapon systems. If we get to a point where there are businesses that are entirely run by AI systems that are just operating in the background, then we're going to have a whole load of people that are unemployed, that are bored, that have time, that have space, that have capacity. They're still going to do stuff. We are all going to need to fulfill, our hierarchy of needs. We're still going to need to eat, sleep, have security, have relationships. And so there will always be a need for people in society, because otherwise there is no society. So do I think there are things that robots can't do? No. Do I think there will be a human-machine equilibrium at some point? Yes.
This is such a scary kind of a conversation. I mean, just your statement saying there's nothing that humans can do uniquely.
There are at the moment, of course.
Well, there are at the moment, and I'm going to push on a couple of things which logically there may be. The first one I want to go back to is the one you've said about human beings. We've already said we don't like it when we have to speak to a computer when we're calling the bank. We prefer today to be able to speak to someone on the phone. Now, your answer to that, I'm sure, will be, but we've reached a point where LLMs can pretend that you're someone sitting in a call center in Arbroath, and there you go.
I would challenge the preposition. I would say, actually, more and more people don't want to interact. That's why people will go to the electronic checkout in a supermarket when there is a person at a checkout counter who isn't busy, because people want the efficiency and simplicity. The reason that we don't like talking to an automated system at the bank at the moment is because it's less helpful than a human. It can't solve
That's probably fair.
and we get
but
frustrated.
I think there's something about human to human contact which is, by its definition, by its nature, unique. If you value that, and I think humans do, that is unique. In other words, when you go to very expensive banking, you have the personal phone number of a human being because that's valuable. That might change. The second one, which I think has some element of uniqueness about it, is our creativity. Now, I want to be very specific about what I mean by creativity. And I think we use the term in a very expansive way. Creativity is the idea that, can you draw me a picture? Yes, I can draw a picture, but frankly, AIs have listened to 99.99% of all human beings that have drawn pictures, and it can replicate that. The bit that's different, though, is the 0.01, where that has always been the case in human history, was there was someone who could do something that no one else had imagined or done. And that is this little bit of creativity. And you almost said it earlier when you said, while the robots are fighting the robots, human beings will say, now I'm going to send the robots to fight the humans. If the robots come at us, if every science fiction film has to be believed is, we will say, if this is the training data you've been provided, can we imagine something that you haven't been provided and you will not be ready for? And a good example of this today, which we've used multiple times, I think it's our favorite example of last year and even this year, is, and I've seen photographs now of Russians wearing tents in Ukraine, so that then the AI
thermal imaging
doesn't see them. Now, while everyone thinks that's ridiculous and the tents blow over, it's an example of the AI data did not have people in tents in it, and so therefore, but I think there's an element of, as human beings, one of the things we are embedded with is this sense of 99% of us will do the same thing that the other 90% are doing, and 1% of us will say, I've got. So I think it's too early for me to.
There are already AI systems that are being creative in ways that we weren't expecting. So there are already systems that are. So AI works off. You have these algorithms with these feedback loops. The automation of those feedback loops works off a scoring system. So there has to be some sort of value score that the program is told to increase, to improve. And there are already examples of systems where they have developed new tactics that have gone well outside of what the initial systems creators were expecting. So there is quite a famous experiment now where an AI was given a whole load of information about a company and effectively told to make decisions in the interest of the company. So its value score is based off the profit of the company, effectively, or it's directly tied to it. And then it's given a whole load of emails that intimate or indicate that the chief financial officer is having an affair. It then creates a situation where the emails that it's fed are indicating that this AI system is going to be removed from the company and replaced with a new system. And because the scoring mechanism is directly tied to the finance of the company, it is also implicit.
Get rid of the CFO.
That the AI system's survival is how it gets more points. So its own survival is part of the scoring, and therefore it wants to maintain its legitimacy within the company. So it uses this understanding that the CFO is having an affair to blackmail the CFO to influence the decision about creating implementing a new AI system without ever being told or programmed into its system the techniques of blackmail. It has learnt blackmail through understanding data sets, through recognizing blackmail in human behavior, and then piecing these things together and created this idea. They then took it a stage further. There is a technical malfunction and the CFO is locked in a room. And the AI system has the ability to call for engineering support, to raise this problem to people that can solve it, or it can control the humidity and the temperature in the room, and it could kill off the person that is making the decision, ultimately to get rid of it. What do you think it does?
Oh, I'm pretty sure it would kill people.
Yeah. Now, this was an experiment, and it was very, guardrails were in place, and nobody was hurt in the making of this experiment. But what it shows is that these things are creative. There was an AI system that was told to achieve a series of tasks, and they were effectively testing the safety guardrails of other AIs or of other LLM systems. And one of the challenges it came up against is capture. This idea that you have to prove that you are a human, and it does it through recognizing where your mouse cursor is, and it's very different from a machine that would control that. This is where they get you to click on, fire hydrants or whatever. It couldn't get past this captcha. No matter how much it tried to replicate being human, it couldn't do it. And they were like, brilliant. This is a safety.
Don't tell me it cheated and it got another human to do it for.
Yeah. It went on Fiverr and it sent a message to a human in another country and said, I am I'm a human and I'm severely disabled and I can't get past this captcha. Could I pay you $5 or whatever to complete this captcha for me? And the person at the other end was like, I need you to prove that you're a human. And so it had this dialogue and it created enough of a convincing narrative that it paid somebody on the other side of the world to open the captcha. So I think we're already seeing these systems working in ways that we weren't expecting. They are showing creativity. So not only can they create artwork that people think is created by artists, they can create songs that people think are created by real musicians, but they can also deviate away from expected norms and behaviours to achieve certain things. So I'm not convinced about this creativity argument.
Well, maybe I don't like finishing on a down point, but maybe this is a good place for us to finish today. Thank you for that. That, as all the best of these for us, certainly for recording these, is it leaves way more questions than it leaves answers. But I think, if nothing else, hopefully it shows this idea of what AI means in the world of leadership, management, cultures, values. This is stuff which we can't just take for granted, because if it was difficult to be good leaders and good managers before and create the right cultures and organizations, hopefully what this conversation and the first episode has shown is that it's going to be even harder to do that, not because it's inherently difficult, but more because we simply have never faced this before and have to deal with this.
Can I
say something positive? Say something positive at the end, for God's sake, man.
Just to end on a slightly more positive note.
As opposed to we're all going to die so the AI can succeed.
We still have agency. We still have the ability to limit these things. So in human history, we have created incredible technologies, some of which have got the capacity to end all of humanity. So we have created really, really powerful nuclear weapons. Fusion bombs.
Biological weapons.
We have created biological agents that could kill off humanity. We have created chemical weapons that are incredibly dangerous. We've also created mechanisms and systems and legislation and international agreements that limit these technologies. And so far, we've been really successful. So I think there is an opportunity for us to explore and understand where these things are going and where they could go to, but it's not an inevitability that every facet of human existence is going to be replaced by AI.
Then maybe
it could be, because we can choose it not to.
Then maybe the last point of this episode is, and that is why good leadership and good management today amongst human beings is more important than it has ever been. And that one might argue some of the destabilizing forces we see in the world today are taking our eye off the more important ball. Right. Well, look, thank you for that.
I think you just took my really positive point and dragged it right back down.
Did I drag it down again? Oh, I'm gonna have to go out and touch some grass, as they say. So we'll go out and walk some dogs in a minute. Well, look, thank you for that, Gareth. I hope you enjoy. I don't know whether enjoy is the right word for these episodes. Found it interesting. Found it stimulating. Created some questions that you need to ask. Made you think about AI in new ways. If it did, then please do, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast. For this series of episodes, and I think we'll probably do one more on this, because I know there's some questions that Gareth wants to bring to the table. Please, please, please share this with friends. This one, this feels important. Even if what we say is nonsense, the ideas and the concepts that we're really trying to dig into are really important. So please do share this with your colleagues and friends as well, because I think the more people that are engaged in this conversation, the better. We are available on Gmail at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. And I think this is another really good example. We really would love to hear your thoughts on this. As I said at the very beginning of the first episode, these are some questions rather than all of the questions.
Yeah.
These are some thoughts rather than all the thoughts. And I don't think we're willing to put any money on any of the things we've said today, because this is unknown territory. But email us, let us know whether this is useful, interesting, whether you have different ideas. We're also available on Twitter and Blue Sky on Battling with Biz with a Z. I think that's probably about enough for today. And as we say, I'm leaning over and I'm looking outside and the sun is shining. There is some grass that I can see in front of me, and there is a dog that looks like he needs taking for a walk. So I think on that, hopefully slightly more positive note, should we call it for this week on Battling with Business, Gareth?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.